Have you ever believed that marrying the person you love also means gaining a second family? I did. For years, I never questioned it. My name is Sophia Carter, and 5 years ago, I married the man I loved more than anything. His name was Ethan. People always said we were opposites. I loved planning every little detail. Ethan believed life always found its own way. Somehow, that balance made us stronger. Every morning before leaving for work, he would kiss my forehead and ask the same question. "Did you remember to eat breakfast?" It was a small habit, but after a long day, those little moments reminded me why I had fallen in love with him. My father-in-law, Robert, welcomed me into the family from the very first day. He never introduced me as his daughter-in-law. Whenever relatives visited, he proudly smiled and said, "This is my daughter, Sophia." The first time I heard those words, I almost cried. He believed respect was something people earned through kindness, not blood. Whenever business became stressful, he invited me to his backyard, poured 2 cups of coffee, and listened without interrupting. Sometimes he gave advice, sometimes he simply listened. Either way, I always felt lighter afterward. Margaret, my mother-in-law, was completely different. She was polite, elegant, always perfectly dressed. She never raised her voice, never insulted me directly. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that made everyone else feel comfortable, except me. Whenever guests were around, she praised my achievements. But when we were alone, she often said things like, "Running a business is much harder than people think," or, "Young people usually become successful too quickly, that's dangerous." At first, I thought she was simply worried about me, so I ignored those comments. 3 years after our wedding, I opened my own logistics company. Nobody handed me the opportunity. I worked for it. I spent years saving money. I worked weekends, accepted projects that nobody else wanted. Slowly, clients began recommending us to other companies. Within a few years, we had built a business I was genuinely proud of. We weren't the biggest company, but our employees trusted one another. That mattered more to me than impressive numbers. I knew almost everyone by name. I celebrated birthdays, visited employees in the hospital when they became sick. If someone had family problems, we tried to help, because I believed people work harder when they know they're valued. Ethan couldn't have been happier. Every evening he'd ask, "How many new clients today?" I'd laugh, "Only 2. He'd grin. "Only? A few years ago you would have celebrated one." He always reminded me how far we'd come whenever I forgot. Margaret also seemed supportive. Whenever family gathered for dinner, she'd proudly tell relatives, "Sophia built a wonderful company." Hearing that made me think I'd misunderstood her all those years. Maybe she really had accepted me. Maybe my worries had simply been in my imagination. I wanted to believe that. I truly did. About 6 months later, small things started happening. Nothing serious. A client canceled a meeting without explanation. A confidential proposal somehow reached one of our competitors. One supplier suddenly raised prices after learning details that should have remained inside our office. Individually, none of those problems seemed unusual. Business is unpredictable. I told myself not to overthink it. Then, one afternoon, my finance manager knocked on my office door. "Sophia, do you have a minute?" He looked uncomfortable. That wasn't like him. "Of course." He closed the door behind him before speaking. "Someone accessed several confidential files last weekend." I frowned. "Was anything stolen?" "Not exactly, but whoever opened those files had no reason to see them." He handed me a printed report. Several employee names appeared on the page. I recognized every one of them. People I trusted, people who had worked beside me for years. Still, I refused to jump to conclusions. There had to be another explanation. There always was. Or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. I stared at the report for several minutes. There were 11 names. Some had worked with me since the company opened. Others had joined later and quickly earned my trust. I looked at my finance manager. "Could this be a system error?" He slowly shook his head. I checked it 3 times. Silence filled the office. Finally, I folded the report and placed it inside my desk drawer. "Don't tell anyone yet." He nodded. "I thought you'd say that." That evening, I tried to act normal. Ethan was already setting the dinner table when I walked through the front door. He smiled the moment he saw me. "Tough day?" I forced a smile. "Just a long one." He gently touched my hand. "You don't have to carry every problem alone." Sometimes, he knew exactly what I needed to hear. But this time, even I didn't know what the problem really was. The following Sunday, we had dinner at his parents' house. Robert was grilling steaks in the backyard. As usual, he waved me over. "Sophia, come help me before your husband burns everything." I laughed. "I think Ethan learned from the best." Robert smiled proudly. Those little conversations always reminded me why I loved being around him. Margaret arrived carrying dessert. She looked at me and smiled. "Business still keeping you busy?" "Very." She nodded thoughtfully. "Success attracts jealousy." Her words sounded ordinary, but something about the way she said them stayed with me, almost like she already knew something I didn't. The next morning, another strange thing happened. One of our biggest clients canceled a contract worth nearly 2 years of work. Their explanation was simple. Another company offered exactly the same proposal, at a lower price. Exactly the same proposal, not similar, the same. Only 4 people had access to that document. I suddenly remembered the report in my drawer. 11 names. Maybe those names weren't a coincidence after all. Instead of accusing anyone, I made a different decision. I quietly asked our IT director to strengthen internal security. "No announcements," I told him. "I don't want anyone feeling accused." He agreed. Within 3 days, every confidential file was being monitored. Anyone who opened sensitive documents would automatically leave a digital record. Nobody knew. Except him. And me. Days passed. Everything seemed normal. Employees laughed during lunch. Meetings continued. Projects moved forward. For a moment, I wondered if I had worried for nothing. Then, another notification appeared. A confidential contract had been opened at 11:43 p.m. The office had closed hours earlier. The employee wasn't scheduled to work that night. I quietly checked the security cameras. The person entered the office, printed several pages, took photos with a personal phone, then left. My heart sank. This wasn't carelessness. Someone was deliberately leaking information. That night, I barely slept. Questions kept running through my mind. Who were they working for? Why would someone betray a company that treated them well? And most importantly, who was pulling the strings? I still refused to believe it had anything to do with my family. Not yet. Because if I was wrong, I could destroy relationships that meant everything to me. But if I was right, my entire company was standing on a foundation of lies. The next morning, I walked into the office pretending nothing had happened. I greeted everyone the same way I always did. "Good morning." People smiled back. Some asked about my weekend. Others joked about the coffee machine breaking again. Everything looked perfectly normal, which somehow made it even more unsettling. Instead of confronting anyone, I started paying attention. Not to their words, to their habits. Who stayed late? Who made unnecessary copies? Who suddenly became nervous whenever I entered the room? For nearly 3 weeks, I simply watched. The list slowly became shorter. Out of the original 11 names, only 4 continued behaving suspiciously. The others had legitimate reasons for accessing confidential files. I felt relieved. Maybe I had judged innocent people too quickly. One afternoon, our HR director knocked on my office door. "Sophia, Margaret called." I looked up. "My mother-in-law?" "Yes." "She asked if we're hiring new managers." I frowned. "Did she say why?" "No." "She only mentioned that she knows several experienced people looking for work." I smiled politely. "Thank you." But after she left, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Margaret had never shown any interest in my business before. Why now? That evening, I decided not to tell Ethan. Not because I didn't trust him, because I loved him. If I accused his mother without proof, our marriage might never recover. I needed facts, not suspicions. 2 days later, another client meeting ended strangely. The client smiled. "I appreciate your honesty. But your competitor already offered us almost the same proposal yesterday." Again, the same proposal, before I even presented it. I drove back to the office in complete silence. This was no longer coincidence. Someone inside the company knew every important move we made. That night, our IT director quietly entered my office after everyone had gone home. He placed a folder on my desk. "I think you should see this." Inside were access records, printer logs, security camera screenshots, and email timestamps. Every suspicious activity connected back to the same group of employees. But something else caught my attention. Several of those employees received personal phone calls every Friday afternoon from the exact same number. The calls lasted only 2 or 3 minutes. Nothing unusual, except the number appeared every single week. I asked quietly, "Can we identify the owner?" He hesitated. "I already did." He slid another page across the desk. My hands froze. The name printed there was one I knew better than almost anyone: Margaret Carter, my mother-in-law. For several long seconds, I couldn't breathe. I read the page again. Maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe someone else used her phone. Maybe there had to be another explanation, because accepting the truth meant accepting something I wasn't ready to believe. The woman who smiled at every family dinner, who asked if I was eating enough, who hugged me every Christmas, might have been secretly working against me the entire time. I slowly closed the folder, then looked at my IT director. "Don't tell anyone. Not even Ethan." He nodded. "What are you going to do?" I stared through the office window at the city lights below. "I'm going to find out whether my mother-in-law is really behind this, and if she is, I want to know why." For the first time, this wasn't just about protecting my company anymore. It was about protecting my family, or discovering that the family I trusted had never truly existed. For the next 2 weeks, I lived 2 different lives. During the day, I was the confident CEO everyone expected me to be. At night, I lay awake wondering if the woman I called Mom had been lying to me all these years. Every family dinner became harder. Margaret smiled, asked about work, complimented my cooking. Nothing about her behavior changed. If I hadn't seen the evidence, I would have believed every word she said. One Friday afternoon, I finally made a decision. I needed proof that nobody could deny. Not assumptions, not phone records, real proof. I asked our legal advisor and IT director to help me set up an internal audit. Quietly. Nobody outside the 3 of us would know. The following Monday, I announced something during the weekly managers' meeting. "We're preparing a confidential expansion project." The room immediately became excited. I continued calmly. "Everything discussed today stays in this room." Everyone nodded. Only 7 senior employees received the proposal. Hidden inside every printed document, our IT team placed a different invisible tracking code. Each copy looked identical, but every document carried a unique digital fingerprint. Whoever leaked it would expose themselves. 3 days later, the phone rang. It was the same client who had canceled before. "Sophia, I don't know what's happening inside your company, but another business contacted us this morning. They showed us your expansion proposal." I thanked him, hung up, then quietly walked to the IT department. Without saying a word, our director opened his laptop. He entered the tracking code. One document appeared. Only one. It had been printed by Linda Brooks, one of our senior operations managers. She had worked beside me for almost 4 years. I trusted her completely. That afternoon, I invited Linda into my office. She smiled as she sat down. "You wanted to see me?" I smiled back. "Yes." "I just wanted to ask something." She relaxed. "What is it?" I slid the proposal across the desk. "Have you shared this document with anyone?" Her answer came instantly. "No." Not even 1 second of hesitation. She looked directly into my eyes. "I would never do that." I simply nodded. "Thank you." She left the room. The moment the door closed, I quietly whispered, "Why would you lie?" Instead of confronting her, I hired an independent investigation firm. If legal action ever became necessary, everything had to be documented professionally. Over the next 10 days, they uncovered something far bigger than I expected. Linda wasn't acting alone. She had introduced several people into different departments over the years. Every hiring recommendation traced back to one person, Margaret Carter, my mother-in-law. She hadn't hired 11 people overnight. She had placed them inside my company, one by one, over nearly 3 years. Each recommendation sounded reasonable. Each employee looked qualified. Nobody questioned it. Neither did I. When the investigators handed me the complete report, my hands were shaking. 11 employees. Every one of them had direct or indirect connections to Margaret. Some were family friends, some were relatives of old neighbors. Others had previously worked for companies owned by people she knew. It wasn't coincidence anymore. It was a pattern, a carefully planned one. That evening, Ethan noticed something was wrong. We were sitting on our back porch. Neither of us had touched dinner. He finally asked softly, "Sophia, are you carrying something alone again?" I looked at him. For a moment, I wanted to tell him everything, but then I imagined the pain on his face. A son hearing terrible accusations about his own mother. I couldn't do that. Not yet. Instead, I reached for his hand. "I promise, when I have the whole truth, you'll be the first person I tell." He gently squeezed my fingers. "I trust you." Those 3 words nearly broke me, because I knew, very soon, that trust would be tested more than either of us could imagine. The investigation report sat inside my desk for 3 days. I read every page, twice, then a third time. I wasn't looking for more evidence. I was hoping to find one mistake, one detail that would prove Margaret wasn't involved. But there wasn't one. Every document pointed in the same direction. The hardest part wasn't protecting my company. It was deciding what to do with Ethan. He deserved the truth, but he also deserved to hear it at the right time. Not as an accusation, as a fact. That Friday evening after dinner, I placed the investigation file on our kitchen table. "Ethan, we need to talk." He looked at my face and immediately turned serious. "What happened?" Without saying a word, I pushed the folder toward him. He opened it. The room became completely silent. I watched his expression slowly change. Confusion, disbelief, then sadness. He finished reading and quietly closed the file. "This can't be true." "I wanted it to be wrong too," I whispered. "I waited until I had proof." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing both hands across his face. "My mother wouldn't—" His voice broke. Then he looked at me. "You wouldn't lie about something like this." I reached across the table and held his hand. "I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm asking you to stand beside the truth." He nodded slowly. "We'll face it together." For the first time in weeks, I finally felt like I wasn't carrying the burden alone. The following Monday, I scheduled an emergency board meeting. Only senior executives were invited, including the 11 employees under investigation. No one knew why. The atmosphere felt unusually tense. People whispered quietly before the meeting began. Some looked nervous. Others looked confused. Margaret wasn't invited. This meeting was about my company, not my family. When everyone had taken their seats, I stood up. "Thank you all for coming. I've always believed this company succeeds because of trust. I still believe that." I paused. "But trust only matters when it's protected." The room fell silent. Our IT director dimmed the lights. The presentation appeared on the large screen. Access records, security footage, printer logs, email timestamps, one by one. The evidence appeared. No dramatic music, no raised voices, only facts. Nobody spoke. Several employees looked at one another in complete shock. Linda's face turned pale. She realized before anyone else that the truth was impossible to deny. Finally, she lowered her head. "I'm sorry." Those two words echoed through the room. Another employee quietly admitted sharing confidential information, then another. Within minutes, every piece of the investigation fit together. No one argued, no one denied the evidence. One board member looked at me. "What happens now?" I answered calmly. "Every employee involved will be suspended immediately while legal procedures continue. This company deserves people who protect it, not people who quietly work against it." Security escorted the employees from the building peacefully. No shouting, no public humiliation, just consequences. Exactly as company policy required. After everyone had left, I remained alone inside the boardroom. The chairs were empty. The projector had been turned off. For the first time in weeks, the office felt quiet. But my heart wasn't. Because the hardest conversation still hadn't happened. Margaret still didn't know that everything had finally come to light. I didn't go to Margaret's house that evening, neither did Ethan. For the first time since our wedding, our family dinner never happened. Instead, Robert called. His voice sounded unusually quiet. "Sophia, Ethan told me everything." I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry you had to hear it this way." After a long silence, he said, "Come over tomorrow. Both of you." The next afternoon, Ethan and I walked into his parents' living room together. Nobody spoke. Margaret was arranging flowers as if it were any other day. She smiled when she saw us. "You're both early." Then she noticed our faces. The smile disappeared. Robert placed a thick folder on the coffee table. "I think it's time we talked." Margaret looked confused. "Talk about what?" Robert slowly pushed the folder toward her. "Read it." The room became completely silent. Page after page, Margaret turned the documents. Her expression changed. She knew exactly what they were. She didn't ask where they came from. She didn't deny the phone records. She didn't question the investigation. She simply sat there, holding the papers with trembling hands. Finally, she looked at me. "So, you know," I nodded. "Yes." Ethan couldn't hold back any longer. "Mom," his voice cracked. "Why? Why would you do this to Sophia?" Margaret looked at her son. For the first time, I didn't see confidence in her eyes, only regret. She took a deep breath. "I never hated Sophia. I was afraid of her." Nobody spoke. She continued quietly. "When your company started growing, everyone talked about Sophia. They admired her. They praised her." She looked down. "I spent my whole life helping your father build his business, but nobody ever remembered my part. Then suddenly, my daughter-in-law became the successful businesswoman everyone admired. I became jealous." Her words were painful, not because they were cruel, because they sounded human. "I convinced myself, I'm only protecting this family. I wanted someone inside the company to tell me what was happening. But little by little, it became something much worse." She wiped away a tear. "I kept making excuses until I couldn't stop." Robert stood up. His disappointment filled the room. "I trusted you. I trusted your judgment. You betrayed this family, and you betrayed Sophia." Margaret lowered her head. "I know." For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "I didn't come here because I wanted revenge. I came because I wanted the truth. I already have it. I'll let the company handle everything according to the law. But as a family, that's a decision Ethan and you have to make." Ethan looked at his mother. Tears filled his eyes. "I still love you. You're my mother. But love doesn't erase responsibility. You have to accept what you've done." Margaret quietly nodded. "I will." A few weeks later, the company's legal process ended. The employees involved left the company. Some resigned. Others were dismissed according to company policy. The business slowly recovered. Our clients stayed. Our team grew stronger. Because trust, once broken, can only be rebuilt through honesty. Margaret wrote me a handwritten letter. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply apologized. She admitted every mistake. She accepted every consequence. I kept the letter. Not because it erased the past, but because it reminded me that people can admit when they're wrong. Months later, Robert visited my office. He smiled as he looked around. "You've built something special." I smiled back. "I didn't build it alone." He nodded proudly. "That's exactly why it'll last." As he stood to leave, he paused at my office door. "You know, I still introduce you as my daughter." This time, I couldn't stop the tears, because after everything we had been through, those words meant even more than they had on the first day.